The gold miner's last wish. A dying man gives a map to a saloon girl, not for gold, but to find his long-lost granddaughter. The girl? She's been working in the same brothel. Unaware of her lineage, the saloon's air was thick with a stench of whiskey, tobacco, and despair, a haze that clung to the worn wooden walls of Virginia City's last refuge for broken souls. In the winter of 1878, the Montana Territory was a land of fleeting fortunes, where men chased gold until it consumed them, leaving only ghosts in their wake. Amid the clamor of clinking glasses and raucous laughter, a young woman named Lila stood at the edge of the room. Her tray laden with drinks, she served the men who barely saw her. Her dress, once a vibrant blue, was faded and patched, its hem stained from nights spent dodging spilled liquor and wandering hands. At 22, her eyes held the weariness of someone twice her age, their hazel depths reflecting a life that had offered little kindness. 3 years ago, she had been a girl with dreams, clutching a tattered letter from her mother that promised a new start in the West. But the journey had ended in betrayal. Her mother, sick with fever, had died on the trail, leaving Lila alone in a world that cared nothing for an orphan with no name or coin. A man in a fine suit had offered her work, his smile smooth as oil, and she had followed him to the saloon, not understanding the price until it was too late. Now, she moved through the crowd, her steps practiced, her smile a mask that had the ache in her heart. The other girls whispered of escape, but Lila had seen what happened to those who tried. Bruises, broken spirits, or worse. She had learned to survive, to keep her head down, to let the world's cruelty pass over her like a storm. The saloon was alive tonight, its patrons a mix of miners, drifters, and men chasing dreams as fleeting as the gold in the hills. Lila wove through them, her tray steady, her eyes scanning for trouble. At a corner table, an old man sat alone, his shoulders hunched, his hands trembling as he clutched a tin cup. His name was Amos Reed, a gold miner whose luck had run dry long before his body began to fail. His cough rattled through the din, a hollow sound that drew no pity from the crowd. Lila had seen him before, always alone, his eyes fixed on some distant memory. Tonight, though, he looked different. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and a quiet urgency clung to him like dust. She approached his table, setting a glass of water before him, a small act of kindness she offered when no one was watching. Amos looked up, his eyes cloudy but sharp, and for a moment he saw her, not the saloon girl, but Lila, the woman beneath the mask. "You're kind," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Not many are in a place like this." Lila offered a faint smile, unsure how to respond. Kindness was a luxury she could ill afford, yet his words stirred something in her, a flicker of warmth she had long buried. As the night wore on, the saloon grew louder, the air heavy with smoke and desperation. Lila returned to Amos's table, noticing his trembling hands and the way he clutched a folded piece of paper, its edges worn as if handled 1,000 times. He beckoned her closer, his voice low. "I don't have much time, girl," he said, his words punctuated by a cough. "But I've got something for you. Not gold, though I've spent my life chasing it. Something better." He pressed the paper into her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "It's a map, not to a mine, but to my granddaughter. She's out there, somewhere in this godforsaken town. Find her for me. Tell her I'm sorry." Lila's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the paper. She wanted to ask questions. Who was this granddaughter? Why was she lost? What did he mean by sorry? But Amos's eyes were closing, his breath slowing to a faint rattle. She knelt beside him, her heart pounding, as the saloon's noise faded into a distant hum. His hand fell limp, and she knew he was gone. The other girls barely noticed, their laughter sharp and brittle. But Lila felt the weight of his final wish settle on her shoulders. She slipped the map into her pocket, her mind racing with questions she could not answer. The night dragged on, and Lila served drinks with mechanical precision, her thoughts consumed by the map and the old man's words. When the dawn light spilled over Virginia City, painting the muddy streets in hues of gold and shadow, but Lila felt no warmth as she stood outside the saloon, the map Amos had given her tucked tightly in her pocket. The weight of the old miner's dying was pressed against her, a burden she neither understood nor wanted, yet could not cast aside. Her fingers traced the paper's edges, worn soft by years of handling, and she thought of his final words. Find her. Tell her I'm sorry. The name Clara haunted her, a ghost she did not know but felt bound to, as if the old man's plea had awakened a part of her long buried, a part that still believed in promises kept. The town was stirring, its rhythm harsh and unyielding. Miners trudged toward the hills, their picks slung over shoulders, while merchants opened their doors with a clatter of shutters. Lila's shawl did little to shield her from a morning chill, and her eyes burned with exhaustion. She had not slept, her mind too full of Amos's map and the stranger who had spoken to her at dawn. Daniel Harper, the rancher, had offered her shelter with no demands, his voice carrying a sincerity she had learned to distrust. Yet his words lingered, a quiet beacon in the storm of her thoughts. She started down the street, her boots sinking into the mud, the map guiding her toward the boarding house on the town's edge. The saloon's noise faded behind her, replaced by the clink of harnesses and the distant shout of a teamster. She kept her head down, avoiding the gazes of men who saw her only as a saloon girl, their eyes either leering or dismissive. The memory of her first night in that place clawed at her, her mother's death still raw, the man in the fine suit promising work, only to lead her into a cage of painted smiles and shame. She had survived by hardening her heart, but Amos's map had cracked that armor, stirring a longing for something more. The boarding house was a sagging structure, its paint peeling like old skin, its windows clouded with dust. Lila hesitated at the door, her hand trembling as she knocked. A woman answered, her face lined with years of hard living, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Lila's worn dress. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp. Lila swallowed, her throat dry. "I'm looking for a girl named Clara," she said, holding up the map. "An old man Amos Reed sent me." The woman's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing over her face. "Clara's upstairs," she said grudgingly, "but she ain't one for visitors." Lila climbed the narrow stairs, the air heavy with the smell of stale bread and lye. At the top, she found a door ajar, revealing a small room where a girl sat mending a shirt. She was young, no more than 16, with dark hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that held a quiet defiance. Lila's heart stuttered. There was something familiar in the girl's face, a shadow of her own features, though she could not place why. "Clara?" she asked softly. The girl looked up, her needle pausing, her gaze wary. "Who are you?" she said, her voice low but steady. Lila hesitated, the map heavy in her hand. "I knew Amos Reed," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He passed last night. He asked me to find you." Clara's face paled, her hand stilling. "My grandfather," she whispered, more to herself than to Lila. "He's gone." Lila nodded, her throat tightening at the girl's sudden vulnerability. She wanted to say more, to explain the map, the apology, but the words felt too fragile for this moment. Instead, she sat across from Clara, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions. Before she could speak again, a shout from below broke the moment. The boarding house woman's voice carried up the stairs, sharp with irritation. "Lila, you got no business here. Get back to the saloon." Clara's eyes widened, recognition dawning. "You're from a saloon?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and caution. Lila nodded, shame prickling her skin, but Clara's gaze held no judgment, only a quiet understanding that made Lila's chest ache. "I work there too," Clara said softly, her voice barely audible. "Since my ma died, I didn't know he was looking for me." Lila's breath caught, the pieces of Amos's story falling into place. Clara was his granddaughter, trapped in the same cruel world that had claimed Lila, unaware of the grandfather who had spent his final days searching for her. She wanted to stay, to tell Clara everything, but the boarding house woman's shouts grew louder, and Lila knew her absence at the saloon would not go unnoticed. "I'll come back," she promised, pressing the map into Clara's hands. "Keep this safe." Clara nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and Lila left, her heart heavy with the weight of their shared loss. As she walked back through the town, the cold seeping through her shawl, Lila felt the pull of Amos's wish stronger than ever. She had found Clara, but the task was far from over. She needed to protect her, to give her the apology Amos had died longing to deliver. But the saloon's grip was tight, its owner a man who saw his girls as property, not people. Lila's step slowed as she neared the saloon, her resolve wavering under the weight of her own captivity. It was then that she saw him again, Daniel Harper, the rancher, leading a horse laden with supplies down the street. His eyes met hers, steady and kind, and he paused, sensing the turmoil she carried. "You look like you could use a friend," he said, his voice gentle, no trace of pity or expectation. Lila's instinct was to retreat, to shield herself from his kindness, but her exhaustion won out. "I don't have friends," she said, her voice brittle. "Not in this place." Daniel nodded, as if her words were not a rejection, but an invitation to prove her wrong. "My ranch is a mile out," he said, pointing west. "There's a spare room, a fire, some stew. You're welcome to it, if you need a place to think." He hesitated, then added, "Bring the girl, if she needs it too." Lila's heart stuttered at his words, the offer so simple yet so profound. She wanted to refuse, to cling to the safety of her distrust, but the memory of Clara's eyes, so like her own, held her back. She nodded, a small gesture that felt like a leap. Daniel tipped his hat, then led his horse away. Leaving her standing in the street, the maps weighed a reminder of her purpose. She returned to the saloon, her steps heavier but her heart lighter, as if Daniel's offer cracked open a door she had thought long closed. That night, as she served drinks to men who saw her as nothing, she held on to the image of Clara, of Daniel's ranch, of a life where kindness was not a trap, but a promise. For the first time in years, Lila felt the stirrings of hope, fragile but fierce, and she knew she would return to Clara, no matter the cost. Lila woke to the faint aroma of coffee, a bitter warmth that curled to the air of Daniel Harper's ranch house, pulling her from a sleep deeper than any she had known in years. The room was small, its walls rough-hewn logs, but it was warm, the quilt draped over her soft with age and care. She lay still for a moment, her body heavy with the unfamiliar comfort of safety, her mind struggling to piece together the night before. After leaving Clara at the boarding house, Lila had returned to the saloon, her heart tangled with Amos's dying wish and the weight of her own trapped existence. The hours had dragged, each leering glance and shouted order chipping away at her resolve, until exhaustion had driven her to Daniel's offer. She had walked a mile to his ranch under a starless sky, her shawl no match for the biting cold, and found him waiting by a fire, his eyes kind but unintrusive. He had offered her a bowl of stew, a blanket, and this room, asking nothing in return. Now, as dawn's light slipped to the narrow window, Lila rose, her bare feet brushing the clean wooden floor. The room was sparse, a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a small chest with a chipped porcelain wash basin. But it was tidy, every detail speaking of a man who lived with purpose despite his solitude. A pair of boots, too small for Daniel, sat in the corner, their leather worn but polished, and Lila's chest tightened at the sight, a reminder of the daughter he had lost. She pushed the thought aside, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the main room. The fire crackled low, and a pot of coffee sat on the stove, its steam rising in lazy curls. Outside, she heard the rhythmic thud of an axe, steady and unhurried, and through the window, she saw Daniel splitting wood, his movements as deliberate as the dawn. The house was modest but cared for, its details telling a story of loss and resilience. The table was scarred but swept clean, flanked by two chairs, one slightly askew, as if waiting for someone who would never return. A shelf held a few books, their spines creased from use, and a single photograph, a woman with a gentle smile, her eyes bright with love that lingered in the room's quiet corners. Lila's gaze lingered on the photograph, a pang of recognition stirring in her. She had seen that kind of loss in her own reflection, in the mirror of the saloon's back room, where dreams went to die. Yet here, in this house, loss had not hardened into bitterness, but into something softer, something that made space for her. Daniel returned, his arms laden with firewood, his coat dusted with frost. He paused at the sight of her, then nodded, as if her presence was a natural part of his morning. "Coffee's ready," he said, setting the wood by the hearth. "There's bread and jam on the table. Help yourself." He gestured toward a loaf wrapped in cloth, then added, "I'm heading to check the cattle. If you want to leave, the trail back to town's clear. If not, The room's yours as long as you need it. His voice was steady, offering choice without pressure, and Lila felt a knot in her chest loosen. Though her suspicion lingered, a reflex honed by years of betrayal. She poured a cup of coffee, its warmth steadying her hands, and sat at the table, the bread soft and fragrant under her touch. The silence of the house was a stark contrast to the saloon's chaos, its stillness both foreign and soothing. She thought of Clara, the girl at the boarding house, her dark braid and guarded eyes so like Lila's own. The map, now tucked in her dress pocket, felt like a promise she could not break, but the thought of returning to town, to the saloon's grip, filled her with dread. She sipped the coffee, wincing at its bitterness, and watched Daniel through the window as he led a horse from the barn, his movements calm and sure. As the morning unfolded, Lila found herself drawn to small tasks. Sweeping the floor, washing the dishes from last night's stew, folding the quilt that had kept her warm. Each action felt like a repayment, a way to balance the debt of Daniel's kindness. Though he had asked for nothing, when he returned at midday, his hat tilted back, he noticed the swept floor and the neatly stacked dishes. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But it's good to see the place cared for." Lila met his gaze, her hand stilling on the broom. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet gratitude that made her heart ache. He handed her a pair of gloves. They're leather-worn but sturdy. "They're warm," he said simply. "Winter's not done yet." Lila took them, her fingers brushing his, and felt a warmth that had little to do with the gloves. She watched him as he moved to the stove, stirring a pot of soup, his back to her, as if giving her space to decide her next step. Outside, the cattle lowed softly, and the wind carried the faint scent of pine. Lila slipped the gloves on, their fit loose but comforting, and felt a shift within her. She had spent years surviving, guarding her heart against a world that took without giving, but here, in this quiet house, she felt the stirrings of something new, a sense of belonging, fragile but real. She chose to stay, though she did not say it aloud. Instead, she helped Daniel with the soup, chopping carrots he had brought from a root cellar, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. Their conversation was sparse, where to find the best firewood, how to keep the cattle from straying, but it felt like a beginning. As they ate, the soup warming her from within, Lila watched Daniel through the steam, her suspicion tempered by curiosity. He spoke little of himself, but she saw the care in his actions. The way he checked the fire, the way he left a clean pair of socks for her by the door, no pressure in the gesture. That afternoon, she stepped outside, the gloves keeping her hands warm as she helped Daniel stack firewood. The ranch was small, its fences weathered but sturdy, the barn filled with the sweet smell of hay. She saw the care he put into every detail. The fed animals, the mended harnesses, the stack of blankets in the barn for colder nights. It was a life built from loss, yet it held a quiet strength that drew her in. As the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lila felt a question forming, one she was not ready to ask. Could she find a place here, not just for a night but for a life? That evening, as they sat by the fire, Daniel whittled a small piece of wood, his hands steady and practiced. Lila watched him, the map in her pocket, a reminder of her purpose. She spoke softly, testing the waters. "There's a girl in town," she said. "She needs help. I promise to go back for her." Daniel's hands paused, his eyes meeting hers, steady and listening. "Then we'll go together," he said simply, and Lila felt the weight of her burden lighten, just a little, in the warmth of his promise. The Montana winter softened its grip, the snow giving way to patches of damp earth, and the first whispers of spring. Lila stood in the doorway of Daniel's ranch house, the morning air sharp against her skin, the gloves he had given her warm around her hands. The past days had settled into a quiet rhythm, mornings spent tending the fire, afternoons helping with small chores, evenings by the hearth where silence spoke as much as words. The house, with its scarred table and faded quilt, had become a refuge, its simplicity a balm to the wounds Lila carried from the saloon. Yet the map in her pocket, Amos's dying wish, tethered her to Virginia City and to Clara, the girl whose eyes mirrored her own in ways she could not yet understand. Daniel moved through his days with the same steady purpose, his hands always busy, mending a fence, feeding the cattle, carving a small wooden horse to the shelf that held his late wife's photograph. Lila watched him, her suspicion fading but never fully gone, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She saw the grief he carried in the lines of his face, the way his eyes softened when he spoke of his daughter, lost to the same winter that had taken his wife. Yet he offered her no pity, only a quiet respect that made her feel seen, not as a saloon girl, but as Lila, a woman with a past she had not chosen and a future she dared not hope for. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, Lila found herself at the table, kneading dough for bread, the act grounding her in a way she had not expected. Daniel entered, his coat dusted with frost, a small bundle of wild greens in his hands. "Found these by the creek," he said, setting them beside her. "Thought they'd go well with supper." His voice was low, unhurried, and Lila noticed the way he lingered, not pressing but present, as if her presence in his home was enough. She nodded, her hands pausing on the dough, and felt a warmth that had little to do with the fire. "Thank you," she said, the word simple but heavy with meaning. As the days passed, Lila's thoughts turned often to Clara. She had promised to return, to deliver Amos's apology, but the saloon's shadow loomed large. She knew the owner, a man named Hargrove, whose smile had a cruelty that tightened like a noose. To go back was to risk his anger, his claim on her as property. Yet Clara's face, her quiet defiance, haunted Lila, a reminder of her own younger self, before the world had hardened her. She spoke of it one evening, as she and Daniel sat by the fire, the crackle of the flames filling the silence. "There's a girl in town," she said, her voice soft. "Clara, she's like me, trapped. I need to help her." Daniel's hand stilled on the knife he was sharpening, his eyes meeting hers. "Then we'll get her," he said, his tone as steady as the earth beneath them. "You don't have to go alone." Lila's breath caught, the weight of his offer settling over her. She wanted to argue, to protect him from the saloon's ugliness, but the sincerity in his gaze stopped her. She nodded, her throat tight, and felt a bond forming, fragile but real, like a seedling pushing through frozen ground. The next day, they set out for Virginia City, the trail winding through hills dusted with new grass. Daniel rode beside her, his horse steady, his presence a quiet anchor. Lila's heart raced, not just from the thought of facing Hargrove, but from the nearness of Daniel, the way his eyes flicked to her, checking without crowding. They spoke little, the silence filled with the creak of the saddle and the distant call of a hawk. When the town came into view, its wooden buildings stark against the gray sky, Lila's stomach twisted. She clutched the map in her pocket, its edges soft from her touch, and steeled herself for what lay ahead. At the boarding house, Clara was waiting, her braid loose and her eyes wary but hopeful. Lila knelt before her, her voice low. "I'm here to take you away," she said, holding out the map. "Your grandfather wanted you to know he was sorry. He loved you." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she took the map. "I thought he forgot me," she whispered. Lila shook her head, her own eyes stinging. "He never did." Before they could leave, the boarding house woman appeared, her face twisted with suspicion. "Hargrove's looking for you," she said to Lila, her voice sharp. "You think you can just walk away?" Lila froze, fear clawing at her, but Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "She's not going back," he said. "Neither's the girl." The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering between them, then backed away, muttering about trouble she didn't want. They hurried to the street, Clara clinging to Lila's hand, but the saloon's shadow loomed closer. Hargrove stood outside, his fine suit a stark contrast to the mud beneath his boots, his eyes narrowing as he saw Lila. "You're mine, girl," he said, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "You and the new one both." Clara flinched and Lila's heart pounded, but Daniel stepped between them, his stance unyielding. "They're under my protection," he said, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "You let them go." Hargrove's smile was cold, his hand twitching toward his own gun, but the crowd around them, miners, merchants, curious onlookers, shifted, their murmurs a warning. Daniel's reputation as a man of quiet strength carried weight, and Hargrove sensed a tide turning. "You'll regret this," he spat, but he stepped back, his eyes promising retribution. Lila's knees trembled. but she held Clara close, her resolve hardened by Daniel's stand. They rode back to the ranch. Clara seated before Lila on the horse, her small body warm against her. The trail was quiet, the hills bathed in the soft light of dusk, and Lila felt a weight lift, though danger still lingered. At the ranch, Daniel helped them down, his hands gentle but strong, and led them inside. He set a pot of soup on the stove, his movement steady, and handed Clara a blanket, his voice soft. "You're safe here," he said. "Both of you." As night fell, Lila sat by the fire, Clara asleep beside her, the map now a shared promise between them. She looked at Daniel, his face lit by the flames, and felt a stir of something deeper than gratitude. He had risked everything for her, for Clara, without asking for anything in return. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling, and he took it, his grip warm and sure. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying all she could not yet say. Daniel's eyes held hers, a quiet question in their depths, and Lila knew that whatever came next, the ranch house glowed softly in the early morning light, its log walls warmed by the sun that crept over the Montana hills. Lila stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass, watching the world awaken in shades of green and gold. Clara slept on the pallet by the fire, her small form wrapped in the blanket Daniel had given her, her face peaceful in a way Lila had never seen at the boarding house. The past days had been a quiet unfolding, each one weaving Lila and Clara deeper into the rhythm of Daniel's life. The ranch, with its creaking fences and lowing cattle, had become a haven, its simplicity a stark contrast to the saloon's chaos. Yet Lila's heart remained restless, haunted by the shadow of Hargrove's threat and the weight of Amos's map, now tucked safely in the chest in her room. Daniel moved through his mornings with the same steady purpose, his hands tending to the animals or repairing the barn's roof, his eyes often finding Lila's with a warmth that made her chest ache. She saw the man he was, kind, solitary, carrying a grief that mirrored her own, yet he offered her no demands, only a space to heal. Clara, too, had begun to bloom, her wariness softening as she followed Daniel to the barn, asking questions about the horses or laughing as she tossed grain to the chickens. Lila watched them, her heart torn between gratitude and fear. Hargrove's words, "You'll regret this," echoed in her mind, a reminder that the world beyond the ranch was not done with her. One morning, as Lila swept the porch, Daniel approached, a small bundle of wildflowers in his hand. "Found these by the creek," he said, his voice low, almost shy. "Thought they'd brighten the table." Lila took them, their delicate petals brushing her fingers, and felt a stir of something she had not allowed herself to name. "They're beautiful," she said, her voice soft, and for a moment their eyes held, the air between them charged with unspoken possibility. Clara ran up, her braid bouncing, and tugged at Lila's skirt. "Can I help with the bread today?" she asked, her eyes bright. Lila nodded, her smile genuine, and the three of them moved inside, the flowers a quiet promise of something new. The days passed in small, meaningful moments. Lila taught Clara to knead dough, their hands working side by side, the active bridge between their shared past and this fragile present. Daniel showed them how to mend a harness, his patience steady as he guided Clara's small fingers. At night, they sat by the fire, Clara's chatter filling the silence, and Lila found herself speaking more, of her mother's laughter, of the dream she had once held before the saloon claimed her. Daniel listened, his eyes never leaving her face, and when he spoke, it was of the land, of the stars that shone brighter here, of a life he had rebuilt from ashes. His words were simple, but they wove a picture of hope, and Lila felt her guard lower, her heart opening to the possibility of a future she had thought lost. Yet the past was never far. At night, Lila's dreams were haunted by Hargrove's cold smile, by the saloon's stifling air, by the fear that he would come for her and Clara. She woke one morning to the sound of hooves, distant but unmistakable, and her heart seized. She rose, pulling her shawl tight, and stepped outside, her eyes scanning the horizon. Daniel was already there, his rifle leaning against the porch, his gaze fixed on a dust cloud approaching from the direction of Virginia City. "Stay inside," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Keep Clara close." Lila nodded, her throat tight, and hurried to wake the girl, her hands trembling as she pulled her to the back of the house. From a window, Lila watched as 3 riders approached, their silhouettes stark against the morning light. Hargrove led them, his fine suit incongruous against the rough terrain, his face set in a mask of determination. 2 men flanked him, their hands resting on pistols, their eyes scanning the ranch with predatory intent. Lila's stomach twisted, fear mingling with a fierce resolve to protect Clara. She whispered to the girl, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "Stay quiet. No matter what happens, you're safe with me." Daniel stood in the yard, his posture unyielding, the rifle now in his hands. "What do you want, Hargrove?" he called, his voice carrying across the distance. Hargrove dismounted, his smile cold and calculating. "The girls," he said simply. "They belong to me. You know how this works. Harper, hand them over, and there's no trouble." Lila's breath caught, her hand tightening on Clara's shoulder. She saw the tension in Daniel's frame, the way his fingers gripped the rifle, and knew he would fight for them, just as he had in town. "I told you before," Daniel said, his voice low but resolute. "They're not yours. They're staying here." Hargrove's smile faded, his hand twitching toward his gun, but Daniel's rifle snapped up, steady and unhesitating. "Don't," Daniel warned, his tone leaving no room for doubt. The 2 men with Hargrove hesitated, their eyes flicking between their boss and the rancher, sensing the shift in power. Lila's heart pounded, her mind racing with the fear of what the standoff could cost. Before the tension could break, a new sound cut through the air, the clatter of hooves, this time from the west. A group of ranchers, neighbors Daniel had mentioned in passing, rode into view, their faces grim but determined. They had heard of Hargrove's reputation, of the Saloon's hold on the town's vulnerable, and their presence was a silent declaration of support. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, his confidence faltering as he realized he was outnumbered. "This ain't over," he spat, but he mounted his horse, signaling his men to follow. They rode off, their dust cloud fading into the hills, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Lila stepped outside, Clara clinging to her side, her heart still racing. Daniel lowered his rifle, his shoulders relaxing, and turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft but certain. Lila nodded, tears stinging her eyes, not from fear but from the weight of the protection, his unwavering stand. She looked at Clara, whose small hand gripped hers, and felt a surge of purpose. Amos's wish had brought her here, to this moment, to this man who saw her not as a saloon girl, but as someone worthy of saving. That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara asleep against Lila's shoulder, Daniel spoke, his voice low. "You don't have to stay," he said, his eyes on the flames. "But there's a place here for you, for both of you, always." Lila's breath caught, the words echoing the hope she had barely dared to feel. She looked at him, his face lit by the fire's glow, and saw not just a rancher, but a man who had given her back her dignity, her future. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling, and he took it, his grip warm and steady. In that moment, Lila knew she had found not just a refuge but a home, and she would fight to keep it, for herself and for Clara. The Montana spring unfurled across the hills, its gentle warmth coaxing wildflowers from the earth and softening the ranch's rugged edges. Lila stood in the doorway of Daniel's house, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, its steam rising in the morning air. Clara was outside, laughing as she chased a chicken across the yard, her braids swinging with each step. The sight of her, so free and unburdened, filled Lila with a quiet joy, though the shadow of Hargrove's threat lingered, a reminder that peace was fragile. The ranch had become a sanctuary, its rhythms of work and rest weaving Lila and Clara into a life that felt almost like a dream. Yet the map, now tucked in the drawer beside Amos's apology, anchored Lila to a purpose she could not abandon, a purpose that had led her to Clara, to Daniel, to this moment. Daniel moved through his days with the same quiet strength, his hands steady as he repaired a fence or led the cattle to pasture. Lila watched him, her heart no longer guarded but open, stirred by the way he treated Clara like a daughter, teaching her to ride or whittling small toys from scraps of wood. He never spoke of the standoff with Hargrove, but Lila saw the vigilance in his eyes, the way he scanned the horizon each evening, his rifle always within reach. She knew he had risked everything for her and Clara, and that knowledge deepened a bond between them. A bond that felt like love, but carried the weight of their shared losses. One afternoon, as Lila hung laundry on the line, the air sweet with the scent of blooming clover, Daniel approached, a small leather pouch in his hand. "Found this in the barn," he said, his voice soft. "Thought you might want it." He opened the pouch, revealing a locket, its silver surface tarnished but intricate, a faint engraving of a rose on its face. Lila's breath caught, her fingers trembling as she took it. "It was my wife's," Daniel said, his eyes meeting hers. "She'd want someone like you to have it." The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight that made Lila's throat tighten. She opened the locket, finding a tiny photograph of a young girl, her smile bright and familiar. "Your daughter," Lila whispered, and Daniel nodded, his grief a quiet shadow between them. Lila wore the locket, its weight a reminder of the family Daniel had lost and the one they were building. Clara, too, had begun to heal, her laughter a constant melody in the house. She followed Lila everywhere, helping with chores or asking questions about the world beyond the saloon, her eyes wide with hope. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara spoke of her mother, a woman who had sung her lullabies before illness took her. "Grandfather used to tell me stories," she said, her voice soft. "I thought he'd forgotten me." Lila knelt beside her, the map in her hand. "He never did," she said, reading Amos's scrawled apology aloud. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, and Lila felt the old man's wish come full circle, a wound beginning to close. Yet the peace was shattered one morning by the sound of hooves, sharp and urgent, echoing across the hills. Lila's heart seized, her hands pausing on the bread she was kneading. Daniel was already outside, his rifle in hand, his face set in a mask of resolve. Lila hurried to Clara, pulling her close, and peered through the window. Hargrove rode into view, alone this time, his suit immaculate but his eyes burning with a cold fury. He dismounted, his movements deliberate, and called out, "Harper, you can't keep what's mine." Daniel stepped forward, his rifle steady, but his voice was calm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "They're not yours, Hargrove. They never were. Leave or you'll answer to more than me." Lila's breath caught, her fear mingling with a fierce pride in Daniel's stand. She stepped outside, Clara behind her, her hand resting on the locket at her throat. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice clear despite the tremble in her chest. "Neither is she." Hargrove's smile was venomous, his hand twitching toward his pistol. But before he could act, a new sound rose, a low rumble of hooves, this time from the north. The ranchers who had stood with Daniel before appeared, their faces grim, their presence a wall of solidarity. Among them was the town's new sheriff, a man who had heard whispers of Hargrove's cruelty and was eager to see justice done. "You're done, Hargrove," the sheriff said, his voice firm. "The saloon's under new management. Your days of owning people are over." Hargrove's face twisted, but the weight of the ranchers and sheriff's presence was too much. He mounted his horse, his eyes promising retribution, but he rode away, his silhouette fading into the dust. Lila's knees weakened, but Daniel was there, his hand steadying her, his eyes warm with relief. Clara clung to her, her small arms a reminder of why they had fought. The ranchers tipped their hats, their support unspoken but profound, and the sheriff nodded to Daniel. "You've got a family here, Harper," he said. "Keep them safe." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, Lila stood in the yard, Clara at her side, Daniel nearby. He turned to her, his hands empty now, vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost," he said, his voice rough with emotion, a reason to keep going. Lila's eyes stung, her fingers brushing the locket. "You gave me a home," she said, her voice trembling. "And Clara, too." Daniel knelt, taking her hand, and pulled a small silver ring from his pocket, its band simple but polished. "It was my mother's," he said. "I've carried it all these years, waiting for the right moment. Lila, will you stay? Not just for now, but always." Tears fell freely now, not from sorrow, but from a joy so fierce it overwhelmed her. She nodded, unable to speak, and he slipped the ring onto her finger, its weight a promise of a future they would build together. Clara hugged them both, her laughter mingling with the evening breeze, and Lila felt the last of her fear dissolve. The days that followed were a tapestry of healing and hope. Clara thrived, her questions about the world answered by Lila's stories and Daniel's quiet wisdom. The ranch became a true home, its walls filled with laughter and love. Lila wore the locket and ring, symbols of the family she had found, and Clara carried Amos's map, a reminder of the grandfather who had loved her. The saloon shadow faded, Hargrove's influence broken by the town's newfound resolve, and Lila knew she had fulfilled Amos's wish, not just in finding Clara, but in giving her a life where she could be free. As spring bloomed fully, Lila stood with Daniel and Clara, the hills alive with color, the future stretching out like the open sky. She had come to this place broken, a saloon girl with no name, no hope. Now, she was Lila, loved and whole, her heart bound to a man and a girl who had become her family. The world had tried to claim her, but here, on this ranch, she had found redemption, love, and a home that would endure.